So good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to today's event and thank you all for being here. It's so nice to see so many people in the audience today. So my name is Christopher Richards and I'm the director of the Women and Gender Studies program here at Brooklyn College. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who also happens to be the program's current endowed chair, Janet Elise Johnson. So Professor Johnson is a professor of political science at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center. Her most recent book, The Routledge Handbook of Gender in Central-Eastern Europe and Eurasia, co-edited with Katalin, Fábián, and Mara Lazda, and Mara is here today with us, won the 2022 Heldt Prize for Best Book in Slavic, East European, Eurasian Women's and Gender Studies from the Association for Women in Slavic Studies, and it is quite a mouthful to say all that. In addition to writing scholarly pieces, Professor Johnson has appeared in The Conversation, The New Yorker, The Washington Post, The Boston Review, The Nation, and Bitch Magazine. And then today's event will also be moderated by Mara Lazda, who's a professor and chairperson of history at Bronx Community College, and also co-editor of the aforementioned award-winning publication. Professor Lazda is a founding member of the BCC Social Justice Network, an advisory board member of BCC's Women Up Resource Center. Professor Lazda researches Latvia, nationalism, post-socialism, gender, and constructions of nationalism and transnationalism. And her work has appeared in Nationalities Papers, the Journal of Baltic Studies, International Journal of Politics, Culture and Society, and Asphasia. And before I turn the podium over to Professors Johnson and Lazda for today's event, which is titled 3 Years of Full-Scale War, How Studying Ukraine Can Change Gender Studies. I just want to briefly thank Professor Johnson, who I know as Janet, for serving as our program's endowed chairperson for the last 3 semesters, almost 4. So Janet and I started together as director and endowed chair, and I just have to say that it's been a really wonderful time. It's not over yet, but I just want to thank you for your collegiality and your cooperation and collaboration, and it's been really a wonderful time. So thank you so much. And I hope all of you enjoyed today's event. So thank you.
I'm more small technicalities.
Yeah.
We make it close. Yes. So we're running this as a hybrid event. One of the things that I do in addition to teaching is running a workshop related to Central-Eastern Europe. So some of those folks are online, and some of them are not in the US. So we're just trying to do both. All right. So it's coming through online, and let me know if they can't hear me. So there's so much going on these days. And I should stay over here. There's so much going on these days, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be here to discuss Ukraine and gender studies. This in itself is a radical act of resistance. And I'm going to give you a trigger warning. I'm going to be talking a lot about fascist, hate speech, mass violence, including sexual violence and queer violence. So here's the question. Why should we be interested in gender studies and Ukraine and Eastern Europe? And the least compelling reason is because the region of the world has been mostly left out of women's and gender studies, which were claimed by the United States and Western Europe. Within gender studies over the last 3 decades, there's been an attempt at a correction. We've gone from the West to the rest, from the 1/3 to the 2/3 world of Africa, Asia, and South America. But still invisible is what we used to call the second world. Let me do this too. Uh-oh. It's not letting me. There we go. So what's been missing is the second world that was under Russian and the Soviet Empire. Before the war, Ukraine had 44 million people, and the region, this whole place, had something close to 500 million people in the former Yugoslavia, the Baltics, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe, some 5% of the world's population. A recent study found that this region is almost completely missing from the reproduction of women's and gender studies globally. There's virtually no scholarship from the region included in introductory textbooks, encyclopedias, or the most prominent journals. Instead, the region, including Ukraine, is folded into the West and the global North. With this lecture, I am marking my 2 years as endowed chair in women's and gender studies at Brooklyn College, and my goals are to be part of writing Ukraine and this region into gender studies. And I will make an argument for why it's important to study Ukraine, laying out 4 lessons that we should learn from this for gender studies and for helping us understand what's going on in the United States today. So to start a little bit of background, I think some of you know something about Russia's war against Ukraine, but just to make sure we're all in the same place. Russia launched its full-scale war of Ukraine 3 years ago yesterday. But the war started for Ukrainians in 2014. For 11 years, the non-nuclear state of Ukraine has held back a nuclear giant who has little concern for the rules of war. And this war is gendered. Building on decades of feminist activism and supporting Ukraine as a whole, women have been central to Ukrainian resistance. In the months after Russia launched its full-scale war, the number of women serving in Ukraine's military doubled. And now Ukraine's military is the biggest in Europe. And they're not just in the background, but last fall, a video captured a former kindergarten teacher shooting down a Russian missile, for example. Outside of the military, women have recreated Ukraine's society by self-organizing for mutual support. They have taken on the responsibilities often left to government and to other citizens. In my research, for example, with recent Brooklyn College graduate and now CUNY law student Veronica Sico, we found out how Ukraine's feminists immediately and innovatively responded to Russia's deployment of conflict-related sexual violence. While slow in 2014, 3 years ago, they jumped into the fray, organizing humanitarian assistance, helping with trauma recovery, helping with documenting and prosecuting the violence, raising awareness, all the while being in a war zone themselves. Women have also taken over roles in journalism, for example. Prominent figures in the Ukrainian media landscape include Vlada Lazor, Alena Korabanova, and Natalia Struk. The full-scale war has also prompted Ukraine's government, after decades of feminist activism, to take gender justice seriously in new ways. So in 2022, Ukraine ratified the Istanbul Convention on Gender-Based Violence, which is the fiercest convention for gender justice in the world. Most countries in the region had fought against the convention because it includes this radical idea that gender is a social construct. Over the last 3 years, Ukraine has developed an incredible response to conflict-related sexual violence, collaborating with feminist organizations, creating a special division within their prosecutor's office, adopting a new Women, Peace, and Security National Action Plan, the first country in the world to do so in the middle of an active war. And they just passed a law to provide reparations, a little bit of assistance for women who have been victimized by sexual violence in the war. They've come up with a new plan to use gender-based metrics in their policymaking and in their budgeting. And there have been important conversations about LGBTQ rights. They have not legalized same-sex unions, but they have banned hate speech. As feminist scholars have shown, modern wars are also gendered for men. Ukrainian men have been gendered into warriors. Most fighting-age men have either been mobilized or unable to leave the country legally. And some 40 to 70,000 soldiers from Ukraine have died. So what can we learn from this war against Ukraine and this region of Eastern Europe in terms of thinking about gender and gender justice? So this is just a picture. I'm sorry, I skipped over something here. I was going to say, I skipped over this section just to say a little bit more about the cost to the Ukrainian society. This is the city of Lviv, which is on the far western side of Ukraine. So the war is on the east. And just to give you a little bit of color, maybe the wrong word, but a little bit of the cost. In Lviv, a city that's supposed to be safe, a father lost his wife and 3 daughters in one moment when their apartment was hit from a hypersonic missile launched from Russia in September. In July, this professor down here, who is a professor of Ukrainian language, a former politician and a big advocate for Ukrainian nationalism, Irina Fábián, was shot by gunshot to her temple by a person who had been radicalized in the war. So lesson 1, let me see, let me kind of move this down. Nope, it's better here. Okay, lesson 1, we must study places like Ukraine, but we must not Westplain. As gender scholars, we have to reflect on our positionality. So to be clear, I am not Ukrainian, I am not Russian. I was born in the United States. No, won't change. There we go. I was trained as a political scientist to focus on Russia, and that has been the majority of my research. I learned the Russian language, and I've been doing this work for 3 decades with the help of a dozen of students from Brooklyn College who have roots in the region. Russia's invasion of Ukraine called me to take more seriously the US and Russian biases of my background and training, leading me to change how I do research and to this lecture. In contrast to this reflexivity and positioning, naming where I come from, many Westerners with little training and background in the region, let alone in Ukraine, have explained Russia's warmongering to the world and to Ukrainians. Some on the left have argued that Russia invaded Ukraine because the US provoked it through NATO expansion. But in their argument, they failed to take into consideration the lives, experiences, security, desires of Ukrainians. It is worse from those on the right, for whom Ukraine is completely dispensable. To understand these dynamics, Ukrainians and Ukrainian feminists in particular have given us a new concept of West-splaining. How many of you have heard of mansplaining? Yes, okay, so this is the Ukrainian version and may be useful for other places as well, where you explain without knowledge to people who actually know things in a condescending, overconfident, often inaccurate and oversimplified manner. So Ukrainian feminist Hanna Hartsenko argues that this West-splaining tends to be gendered, most often from first world heterosexual educated men who have not reflected on their position of privilege. Some critical and gender theorists have gone even further and argue that we should not study places other than the ones that we know, and that if we do, we are engaging in epistemic imperialism. Clearly, I make a different argument, and I made this argument in a recent journal article, but in brief, I want to state that Patricia Hill Collins, for example, who's a Black feminist from the United States, has argued that one's position as insiders, being a member of a community, is an epistemic privilege. It gives us, Ukrainians can see things that I can't, but social science matters too, and being an insider doesn't mean you can see and understand everything. Further, calling all Western-based thinking about Eastern Europe epistemic imperialism discounts the agency of feminist scholars from the region who have studied and written about the region and by now have their own prestige. Here, I also offer a plea. Trump's recent misinformation about Russia's invasion should make it very clear that it should not be the full responsibility of Ukrainians to consider West-splaining. We need feminist scholars in the West to counter the decontextualized, dehistoricized, and often degendered narratives about Ukraine and other places. Western feminists trained in the study of Central and Eastern Europe can be reflexive about their positionality and can serve as in the role of translators and amplifiers of the work by feminist scholars of the region, not just cultural imperialists. Lesson 2, we must expand our understanding of imperial power. These concerns about who gets to study and speak about other places comes out of decolonial critiques. How many have heard about decolonial critiques? No? Okay, well, decolonial critiques are a critical theory that calls us to take seriously the impact of colonialism, not just in what happens in the world, but how we think. But here I want to bring us back to the empirical realities. Those on the left tend to see colonial conquest in Africa, Americas, and Asia, but there's been a tendency not to see colonialism of Soviet and post-Soviet Russia in places like Ukraine. And I think there's a couple of reasons. One is most Ukrainians seem white. If you look at them, they seem white. They don't fit into the US and Western European colonial paradigms. But the project to elide or fold Eastern Europe into the West is part of a larger project to erase people of color. Some Ukrainians, like these in this picture right here, are Crimean Tartars who are Turkic and Muslim and not white in that simple way. There are also Roma in Ukraine, and there are thousands of African students who have made Ukraine their home, at least before the war, the full-scale war 3 years ago. Also, Ukrainians whose whiteness granted them access to Europe in ways that other refugees, such as those from Syria, were not granted access. They have also been dehumanized by Russian propaganda as not fully human. And in Europe, they're not seen as quite white. We talk about them as peripherally white or new immigrant whiteness. With the end of the Cold War, Eastern Europeans, especially Ukrainians, have become the new border guards for Western Europe and the United States. And those who study this region may have been slow to think about race, but studying Ukraine can help us see beyond skin color. It's not just about the surface. I want to give Second, Soviet imperialism has been invisible to many on the left, including Marxist and decolonial feminists, because the Soviet Union claimed to be committed to Marxism, women's emancipation, and decolonization. Somehow, many on the left give post-Soviet Russia the same pass, though its economy is dominated by oligarchs, with Putin at the top, who is the richest man in the world, even more wealthy than our oligarch in charge, Elon Musk. So I can't give all of the evidence today that Russia is a racist and sexist colonial power, but I'll give a couple examples drawn from my research projects related to Ukraine. For one, the Soviet Union took over Ukraine about 100 years ago in what the Ukrainians call the Holodomor, forced starvation. Many genocide scholars now argue that this too was genocide, and it involved a policy of mass starvation, sometimes facilitated by rape. For example, in one documented incident, in a village of Venetia, a member of the towing brigade sent a woman who refused to hand over bread to the headquarters with a note, take her to a dark corner and rape her. Another example, the Soviet Union under Stalin engaged in mass deportation. So here's a map of all of the deportation routes, and here's an image of a train car in which they forced women from Ukraine and men from Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, the Baltic states, Romania, and Poland to be deported. And historians have uncovered evidence of systematic rape, gang rape, and mass rape. And this mass rape was common in the Soviet, quote, liberation of Eastern Europe after World War II, when they went into concentration camps or across the region into people's villages and homes. It's most well documented in Germany and in Berlin alone, for example, some 100,000 rape victims made it to the hospital, maybe 1 out of 10 of the seeming rape victims. So the current conquest of Ukraine has used similar gendered mass violence. The most extensive data we have is from two things. The first couple months of the full-scale invasion, where the Russian military took over new territories and especially went into people's homes. That's where you see sexual violence against women. There also appears to be a lot of sexual violence against men in detention centers under Russian control. And the violence includes rape, gang rape, forced nudity or public stripping, forced witnessing of such rape, and genital mutilation of men. As I am documenting in ongoing research, such sexualized and gendered violence doesn't just happen. It comes out of Russia's long-term commitment to sexist and homophobic policies, including during the Soviet period. For example, the Soviet government never recognized any of the mass sexual violence I've just mentioned. Post-Soviet Russia has become more sexist and homophobic in its ideology. Under the rule of Vladimir Putin over the last 25 years, women's rights have been decimated, with Russia rejecting all sorts of international norms of gender justice, including the right to live free from domestic and sexual violence, and the rights to abortion, non-heterosexual life and mothering, and to organize as women, especially as feminists and lesbians. These reversals are compounded by increased racism for women who are not ethnically Russian, and by warlord colonialism for women in the region of Chechnya and the places they've taken over in Ukraine. Lesson 3, we must understand today's anti-genderism as a global movement backed by Russia. You all know what anti-genderism is. Now, how many have seen this executive order by Trump? Right? So one of the first things Trump did is issued an executive order, quote, defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring the biological truth to the federal government. This order argues that there are gender ideologues, I guess like me, who deny the biological reality of sex and whose ideas that gender is constructed fundamentally attack women by depriving them of their dignity, safety, and well-being. The order calls for the reestablishment of sex as a biological and binary throughout federal agencies and the overturning of recent Supreme Court decisions. This comes on top of concerted attacks on gender studies in the US, such as the recent dismantling of the gender studies program at New College. And it comes from Project 2025. Any of you familiar with Project 2025? Right? So anti-genderism underlies this. This was a document laid out that told us everything Trump was planning to do. And central to it is these kind of critiques on gender. Now, anti-gender actually began, as far as I can tell, at least as far as I can tell, within Russian universities in the early 2000s. I heard colleagues in sociology and philosophy making really horrific comments about how there was going to be no more need for men because of LGBTQ and feminist activism and reproductive technologies. But in Ukraine in the 2010s, it became a huge part of their colonizing or recolonizing project. And in Ukraine, it was called the Stop Gender Campaign, and it was particularly well orchestrated and funded. It was clear at that moment that it was coming from Russia. The first document appeared, and it was called Gender Without Embellishment, Through Gender Equality Policy Towards the Dictatorship of Homosexualism. So there's this way of inverting the narrative so that they're arguing they are not dictators, but they're being dictators, and they're worried about the dictatorship of women's and LGBTQ rights. Anti-genderism is more than a simple backlash. It is a transnational movement with roots in US evangelicalism. So the other roots here are the World Congress of Family in Illinois, which set up this kind of movement in collaboration with the sociology department in Moscow. It's a transnational movement. It has roots also in the Vatican. It has regime support from Hungary and Poland, and it is flush with money from Russia's oligarchs. Some of whom are committed to the cause, and also the Russian regime, which has been using anti-genderism as a way to destabilize democracy and support extremist groups. The target of the movement shifts over time and place, including attacks on same-sex marriage, abortion, contraception, and trans rights. But underneath are critiques of the feminist idea that gender is constructed and the queer idea that we can love whom we want. As Polish feminist Elżbieta Koroszuk argued, anti-genderism is not an ideology, but a counter-knowledge that takes and subverts our understanding of gender studies. They claim to be defending or protecting women and children, but they are actually doing the opposite. These are kind of offensive images, but I want you to kind of see how this works. Russia's anti-genderism became fascist in its messaging during the 2020 campaign for constitutional amendments, in which Putin gained complete control over Russia. By fascism, I mean a call for the violent overthrow of constitutional democracy to rebuild what are claimed to be ancient values or traditional values. And I point to the particular cruelty and the way that they appeal to our fears, often using gendered and sexualized anti-feminist ideas. So there was one video ad in Russia that was put together actually by Prigozhin. For those of you who know a lot about the war, his Wagner group was a big part of the violence and destruction in Ukraine. It was his organization that put together this ad on the top left. So it's this beautiful, in the beginning, ad about this child getting adopted from a Russian orphanage. There are a lot of kids in Russian orphanages, and Russian orphanages are awful. And so this man comes and picks up his child, and he brings him out to the car, and the women who've been taking care of the child say, "Well, where's your mother?" And he says, "Well, there she is." And there's an image of a very, I guess in our language, we might call flamboyant person here. And the rest of the video is about the horror of a child being raised by what appears to be a gay man. The video was hate speech and suggested that sexual rights were a dire threat to Russian civilization. If you don't vote for these amendments, Russia's children will be given away to gay men. That's the story they were telling us. And in these ways, Russia's war against Ukraine became a war of gendered values. So Ukraine is kind of instrumentally, and I think in a good way, using pro-gender equality and pro-LGBTQ rights to argue that they are independent, and this is their anti-colonialism. They're using these things to mark their difference from Russia, and Russia's claiming to be protecting these traditional values for us. And Ukraine is fighting an anti-colonial war, and the positive changes towards gender are one way to decolonize Ukraine. With Trump, the war has come to the United States. For example, this one, how many of you saw these videos? The videos that in October, they were played during the Sunday Night Football. The Trump campaign created the same kind of anti-gender fascist messages, with ads showing footage of Kamala Harris saying that she would promise transgender inmates surgery and support. And the ad ended by proclaiming Kamala Harris is for them, and Trump is for you. So you can see, I think, the sort of fascist messaging underneath here, that the whole world is going to fall apart and be overrun by people who don't fit into gendered and heteronormative boxes. That's lesson 3. Lesson 4 is that we must be more thoughtful and responsive in our feminist solidarity and pacifism. So within weeks of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, European feminists released a manifesto. And the manifesto condemned the invasion of Ukraine, but also called for demilitarization of both Russia and Ukraine. Almost a year later, German feminists released another manifesto, making the same kind of argument, but really going even more strongly about the fact that they wanted Germany to stop sending weapons to Ukraine and to stop supporting Ukraine. US-based organization called Code Pink, which claims to be feminist and pacifist, made similar proclamations. In some ways, I support these calls for peace. I am a feminist pacifist. As feminist IR international relations scholars point out, the US military-industrial complex spends more on national defense than any other country in the world. And even in peacetime, militarized masculinity is central to US and global patriarchy. As feminist scholars of disability show, war is often the key reason that people around the world are disabled. US, like Russia, is also a racist and colonial power, but with the most powerful mechanisms of destruction in the world. However, as Ukrainians have repeatedly pointed out, Ukraine is not the US, and this is no way to do feminist solidarity. None of these groups have expertise in Eastern Europe, and none of these manifestos were written in consultation with Ukrainian feminists. In response to the manifestos, Ukrainians issued their own manifesto. We, feminists from Ukraine, call on feminists from around the world to stand in solidarity with the resistance movement of the Ukrainian people against the predatory imperialist war unleashed by the Russian Federation. Ukrainian feminists argued that demilitarization of Ukraine would mean the demise of the state, its culture, and most of its people. More so than in any other war, Ukrainian feminists have asked for weapons and ammunition. Alina Strelnik explains Ukrainian feminists are not rejecting pacifism. They're showing the failures of the post-World War II and the post-Cold War peace-building processes. These Western calls for demilitarization of Ukraine were not just a result of pacifism, but they reflect, at best, the naivete of many on the left about Russia. At worst, they reflect collusion with Russia. In my research, I found evidence that those involved with the German manifesto had contact with Russian Kremlin officials at the time. Similarly, one of the founders of Code Pink has been implicated in a project to support China, and that country signed an agreement of support with Russia weeks before the full-scale invasion. At the same time, Ukrainian feminists show us how problematic is a feminist solidarity that claims to save others. For example, Ina Aryshkina wrote a scathing critique of how Western journalists and feminists homed in on the concerns facing transgender people trying to leave Ukraine, as if they were poor passive victims and Westerners were, quote, saviors. They did not acknowledge the activism and progress on LGBTQ issues in Ukraine and the desire of many Ukrainians to stay and resist. They did not acknowledge our own failures on transgender rights, which are all too clear now. So what do we do? How do we stand with feminist commitments in solidarity with Ukraine and others today? I argue for pragmatic solidarity, as illustrated by feminists from Eastern Europe. As Ukrainians fled the war 3 years ago, Polish feminists and German feminists helped provide abortions, which were illegal in Poland, to Ukrainians who needed them. In the Czech Republic, there was something called Grandmothers Without Borders, a group in action since the 2015 Syrian refugee crisis, who opened up a women's cafe for Ukrainian refugees. Scholars from the region argue that these things should be seen not as grassroots humanitarianism, but mutual aid, radical collective care. Sounds good right now. That is anti-authoritarian and participatory. So to illustrate, I'm going to tell a personal story. This summer, I was conducting research in Latvia, which is a country near Russia, which has taken in hundreds, 40,000, how many refugees? 40,000 refugees. It's a very small country. And we were doing research on feminist support of Ukrainian refugees with my CUNY colleague, Mara Lazda, who's here. I didn't tell her about this. One day we volunteered for a few hours to weave camouflage nets, which is a common thing for people in Ukraine to do, including school children. The organization was called Tavi Dragi, which was an organization to support previous refugees that had come to Latvia, and it means your friends in Latvian. Apparently this weaving is quite common, but it's something I'd never done. And the way that we got taught to do it, or at least the way I got taught, was in Russian, which there were words that I didn't quite know. And it was the language of Russian colonialism, but it was also pragmatically the language that we had shared in the room between the Latvians and the Ukrainians and the two of us. It was difficult for me on many levels. We kept being called out for doing it wrong. And then they would point out, like, if you do this wrong, if there's too many holes, or if you don't do it right, men are going to die at the front on the longest front line in the world. But also weaving military camouflage, I felt implicated as a feminist and a pacifist in militarization, but it also felt clearly like the right thing to do. Ukrainian feminists have been asking for this and more. So in sum, I'm leaning towards thinking that harm reduction, which is the right way to be instead of feminist pacifism. Harm reduction is a public health approach to dealing with drug addiction. Have you heard of harm reduction? Right? So instead of penalizing everyone for being an addict, it's a way of providing pragmatic support for them. So harm reduction would change feminist pacifism to think about long-term peace and justice as the way of reducing violence and the most just way forward. It is based on compassion, but it's also pragmatic. And as a decolonial scholar, Madina Tolstanova from the region has pointed out, peace and conflict studies are rooted in Western modernity, and Indigenous peoples have a very different way of thinking about justice and peace. To speak to our current turmoil, and I'll end with some insights from my Polish colleague, Elżbieta Koroszok. And one more. There we go. Who recently spoke to this workshop and who spoke to this lecture series at Brooklyn College in the fall. In October of 23, so a year and a half ago, the anti-gender Law and Justice Party, which had been ruling Poland for almost a decade, was defeated in elections. Feminist activists had led a women's strike in 2020. That's a picture of a little bit of that women's strike, which lasted for days. And they were the largest protests ever in Poland. They were on some level against abortion restrictions in Poland, but they were more broadly against anti-genderism and the anti-genderism that was limiting women and other people's bodily integrity. And the activists changed the way society thinks about anti-genderism so that they have not been successful at rooting out all of the things the Law and Justice Party did, but they have fundamentally changed Polish society. At the same time, activists fought back the so-called LGBT-free zones. So there were cities in Poland on the bottom right, you see, where cities claimed that they were going to be free of LGBT people. And they did that by using strategic litigation, so suing through the court system and using existing European laws. Polish feminists and other activists from the region have continued their pragmatic and deep solidarity for Ukrainians for 3 years. So as we face what we're facing today in the United States, these are tactics that can counter anti-genderism. This is solidarity. And as Koroszok has said, I think we must choose hope.